Hey y'all, we're going to continue our study through the book of Ephesians, and we have made it all the way to Ephesians chapter 5. We took on the first two verses in Sunday's sermon, so if you'd like to look at the sermon video and see a little bit of that, it's there. But tonight we will study verses 3 through 14 in Ephesians chapter 5. Here's that whole passage. But fornication and impurity of any kind or greed must not even be mentioned among you, as is proper among saints. Entirely out of place is obscene, silly, and vulgar talk, but instead let there be thanksgiving. Be sure of this, that no fornicator or impure person or one who is greedy, that is, an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore, do not be associated with them. For once you were darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what such people do secretly. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, "Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." So we have, again, more instructions for a body of new believers. And this one new community, this new reality that has been made possible in Christ demands new behavior. We still have a calling here to set aside old things and embrace new things. So let's take a look at verses 3 through 5, and I'll read them again. But fornication and impurity of any kind or greed must not even be mentioned among you, as is proper among saints. Entirely out of place is obscene, silly, and vulgar talk, but instead let there be thanksgiving. Be sure of this, that no fornicator or impure person or one who is greedy, that is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. So this new reality that demands a new behavior now begins to take on the challenges of the transformation of interpersonal morality. And so there is a challenge to what folks might have been doing before they became Christians. And it also may be possible that it was difficult for a lot of folks to let these things go and live a very different life. So there is a challenge here about what Christian believers would have referred to as sexual misconduct. So let's take a look at the words here in verse 3, fornication and impurity. Those words would have referred to any kind of sexual misconduct. And you have to wonder as you read this, is this figurative or literal language? And the answer here is both. In the Old Testament, you'll find many places where a writer of, say, a book of prophecy would refer to infidelity to God in terms of sexual infidelity. Hosea is a good example of that. The loyalty of Israel to God is compared to a wife who is disloyal to her husband. And so this language is rather strong. It gets our attention. It's definitely stark in contrast. There's no backing off here. There's no euphemistic approach. Some of the real issues that the writer of Ephesians wants to deal with here is a practice of sexual immorality that has to be dealt with, and it has to be let go in order to fully embrace a full new life with God through Jesus. So loyalty to God includes a very specific call to morality and a very specific practice of that morality. So the new reality, the new morality that's being proposed here is held up against immoralities, and some very specific ones are mentioned here: fornication, impurity, and any kind of greed. Um, and the writer here says, these things must not be mentioned among you, as is proper among the saints. Now we need to take on that phrase, as is proper among the saints. There was an accepted and expected way that Christians were supposed to behave, how they were supposed to live out their lives. Their ethics had to match this morality. So the instructions here are added to the ones that we read um, in chapter 4, and they indicate that believers were expected to behave a certain way. Believers needed to be seen as believers in the things that they did. And also, this applies to how they spoke and what they said. So they needed to be seen as believers in their deeds and in their words. And verse 4 takes on the idea of their belief in how they spoke. Entirely out of place is obscene, silly, and vulgar talk, but instead let there be thanksgiving. So again, here is the idea that their relationship with God through Jesus is going to transform how they speak. Now remember, Jesus taught that it's not what comes out of a person's mouth that defiles them, or not what goes in a person's mouth that defiles them, but what comes out. And that means that the mouth betrays the condition of the heart. And so these new believers who are being written to here are being challenged about changing their lives, about allowing the love of Jesus Christ to transform them, even how they speak. Their speech should let others know that they are believers. Now, obscene, silly, and vulgar talk can be words that we would choose to use about the things that we desire. How does our lust take on language? And so it can be language that takes on the nature of sexual misconduct, but it also can be language that accompanies just about anything that we might want or desire. A lust for power is going to give us a language of a lust for power. So the transformative work that's happening here in our discipline, in our disciplined approach to how we talk, is that we won't talk about the things that we desire, but we'll replace that talk with that of thanksgiving, that we would be giving thanks to God for the things that we have. Moving on to verse 5, no fornicator, no impure person, or someone who is greedy, that is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Inherit the kingdom here is a good word that we know. We know this also from the Sermon on the Mount, and it basically means for someone to be a believer, to be saved, use our Baptist and evangelical language, that being in a right relationship with God through Jesus Christ is how we inherit the kingdom, or is our inheritance of the kingdom. So notice again in this verse, there is this work of contrast. It is either in or out, and there is no middle ground. So what if you're just a little bit impure? Is that okay? What if you're just a little bit greedy? Is that okay? Well, of course not. Again, there's no wiggle room here, no gray area. You're either in or you're out. Jesus taught it this way: no one can serve two masters. And Jesus was talking about the love of God versus the love of money and material wealth. No one can serve two masters. A friend of mine used to say it this way: you can't stand on the dock and on the boat at the same time. Eventually, the boat will push away and you will fall into the water. So, idolatry here, someone who is greedy, that is an idolater. The idolatry that's defined here, it falls in line with the very standard approach to idolatry that we would see in the Hebrew scriptures. Not just the worship of an idol or a graven image, but the worship of any false deity. In our own lives, it is just as true as it was for the folks reading this letter to the Ephesians, that there are a number of false deities we can find ourselves worshiping. There is the worship of the body, a physical desire for someone else that leads to adultery, that leads to sexual immorality. Also, a worship of our old way, a worship of our old and sinful nature, the things that we don't want to let go of. And also the worship of material wealth, the worship of money, the worship of status, the worship of attention. Whatever enters into our lives that can become a false deity. That is idolatry. Now this verse ends with believers promised an inheritance of the kingdom of Christ and of God. Now that phrase is a little peculiar. Usually in the New Testament, we will read the phrase, the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. We have never come across this phrase, the kingdom of Christ and of God. And basically, here in Ephesians is the only place in the Bible you will read that phrase, the kingdom of Christ and of God. The emphasis there is very important. I guess we could ask the question, well, whose kingdom is it? And the kingdom does belong to God. The kingdom does belong to Jesus. Our Trinitarian beliefs would help us remember that they are one and the same. But the emphasis here is also important, again, as it may even find itself associated with idolatry. We stand to inherit the kingdom of Christ and of God, and nobody else's. It would have been easy back then, and it still is easy now, to rally around the figurehead, to rally around the popular person in the middle of our story of faith. For folks back then, it was problematic to rally around Paul rather than around Jesus, rather than recognizing that Jesus is the foundation of this new reality. And so This phrase, the kingdom of Christ and of God, stands here as a good bit of a reminder of what we are called to. We are called to give our allegiance. We are called to um, totally give ourselves to Jesus. We don't give ourselves to Paul. We don't give ourselves to popular preachers and authors. Our role as believers is in fidelity and loyalty to God through Jesus. It's Jesus who brings the kingdom, and not any person of this world. Let's move on to verses 6 through 14, and I'll read them again here. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore do not be associated with them, for once you were darkness, now in the Lord you are light. Live as children of the light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what such people do secretly. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible. For everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Let no one deceive you with empty words. This implies a little bit of the opposite of what we'd seen earlier in this passage in chapter 4. Obscene, silly, and vulgar talk is out of place. Instead, let there be thanksgiving. Here is something of the opposite of that the reader of this letter would have already encountered people in their lives, perhaps people who were preaching a different message, who were piling up empty words in order to deceive them, in order to fool them. And let me be sarcastic for a moment. We have no perspective on that, do we? Yes, we do. Chances are good that when someone's been trying to convince you to do something or to believe something that you knew to be wrong, the more they could attach words to it, the more they hoped they could convince you. And the more pleasant that sounded, or even the more scientific that sounded, the more convincing they could make that, the more rhetoric they could employ, the more they stood a chance of maybe swaying you in their direction. But the truth is that gifted speech does not equal ethical behavior. Take, for instance, the story we know from Genesis chapter 3 of the fall, of the first sin. God had placed the man and the woman in the garden and told them to enjoy it, to be fruitful and multiply, but gave them some rules to follow. And chapter 3 begins with these words, "But the serpent was more crafty than any of the other animals." And so we know the story of how the serpent began to trick Eve into taking a bite of that fruit. And it is a well-crafted line of speaking that the serpent uses. Definitely a lot of rhetoric that was happening there in order not just to convince, he didn't have to convince the woman, but just to introduce enough doubt that she began to wonder. And so the serpent asked, begins with a lie, really. Were you told that you weren't supposed to eat of any of these trees? And the woman corrects the serpent, saying, well, that's not so. We can eat of any of these trees except for one. If we eat of that tree, we will die. And the serpent then says, you won't die, really? So that introduction of doubt leads to the fall. Don't be deceived by well-crafted speeches. On many occasions, the politicians have shown up and they'll use very religious sounding language. But we really have to test those speeches to see if they are founded on truth or not. Anybody trying to convince you of something, whether it's good or bad, are going to heap up the words in order to be able to do that. And so as you hear more words, as you hear more people use phrases like, I tell you the truth, or it's a fact, those are the times to stop and go, is it really true? Is it really a fact? And decide for ourselves whether these words are founded on something eternal or if they are just empty words. And the promise that the writer of Ephesians makes for the folks who would heap up empty words for the sake of deceiving people is that the wrath of God is coming on those who are disobedient. And the advice is very simple. Therefore, don't be associated with them. And I would suggest that you approach that advice on two levels. Therefore, do not be associated with them. Don't be associated with the empty words themselves. Find yourself far removed from the well-crafted speeches that are designed to lead folks toward disobedience. And also, don't associate with the people who use them. And there is a great reason for that. We need to distinguish ourselves. The early Christian was challenged to distinguish themselves from their former lives. And so, again, we get a picture of stark contrast, the difference between darkness and light. For once you, and it's interesting that we don't say in darkness and in light, but they are actual characteristics here. For once you were darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. This verse talks about not just our identity, but our being, and how Jesus transforms our being. We were once darkness, but now we are light. In Christ, we are becoming something. We are becoming righteous beings. And so we can help Jesus along the way with this. Certainly Jesus has the power to make us light itself. But there is always the expected behavior that comes along with our transformation. If you are light, you need to shine. Live as children of light, it says here. For the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. So there is an expected behavior here. Good ethics accompanies good morality. And so as John the Baptist preached in the wilderness, and even as Jesus taught himself, we are to bear good fruit. And here in Ephesians, in verse 9 here, it says, the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. And I think you can hold these three things up as some of the good fruit of the light. Goodness. Goodness is the outcome of a process of working for that goodness. If goodness is your motivation, I want to do what is good, that will be the outcome of it. That being able to discern what is good is also an outcome of our righteousness. We can either be falsely righteous or truly righteous. The righteousness that every believer in Jesus Christ is blessed with is a righteousness that is founded in a proper relationship with God. So if you're wondering whether you are righteous or not, if your motivations are good or not, check that against what you've already learned. Am I worshiping God or something else? Am I practicing true faith, or am I practicing idolatry? Have I crafted a new religion around the worship of a false deity and asked God and Jesus to bless that anyway? Well, that won't happen. So we can always check our motivations. We can always check the foundations of what we call faith to see if it truly is faith or not. Is it good? And by good, would God look at it and say, that is good? And is it righteous? Is it founded on a proper relationship with God? And that third fruit of the light is truth. The truth that's being talked about here in Ephesians is being certain that we tell the truth about who Jesus is. And so it's not just our confession of Jesus as Lord that is important here, but that lordship of Jesus Christ makes sense in every aspect of our lives. Again, back to the beginning of this passage. Is Jesus Lord in the things that we do? Is Jesus Lord in the things that we say? And so in chapter 4, the challenge was speak the truth to your neighbors. Demonstrate to the people around you that your life reflects who Jesus is. And so the truth is the message of Christian faith. Tell the truth about Jesus. Verse 10 here says, try to find what is pleasing to the Lord. As you read through chapter 5 here, you'll see that verse 10 is kind of in the middle, and it connects that previous section with the section that's upcoming. And I guess it is a better summary of what I just said in check your motivation, check the foundation of what you're doing. Maybe it's a better summary statement if you're focused on goodness and righteousness and truth, that those come under a great heading of trying to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. And this will introduce the next section to come as well. But it's also a very important reminder. This simple verse, try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. Maybe that's something that you just write on a sticky note or an index card and put it where you can see it every day. Put it on the mirror in your bathroom or right by eye level of the door that you walk out of every day. Because it's a reminder that our faith is not a passive thing. That is, that we could make a good confession of faith and then miraculously, I guess, as the dove of the Spirit of the Lord descends on us, it imparts everything to us. Wouldn't that be easier if by making a profession of faith, we got everything we needed to be faithful instantly? And yet, it's not there. Faith is not a passive thing. In other places in the New Testament, you'll hear the advice, work out your own faith with fear and trembling. So the try part of verse 10, try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord, suggests that we should do that. Or as Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount, ask, seek, knock. Ask, it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. It suggests an earnestness of activity in our lives of faith. Verse 11 says, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. Now, that's still part of the contrast you see in previous verses of light versus darkness, right versus wrong. It's still there. But who is this word of advice for? That's kind of something to think about here, because it is easy for us to, at least in words, try to distinguish ourselves from others. And this happens in matters of discipleship. This happens in matters of trying to live out what we believe. We'll draw those lines between ourselves and others. I would say between believers and non-believers, or as a previous generation expressed it to me, between people of faith and people of the world. And of the world had very bad connotations connected to it. You can either belong to the kingdom of God or you can belong to the world. Is really still what's being taught here in Ephesians. But who's being talked to here? Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, instead expose them. And it would be easy to aim this at non-believers. But if you think about it, these are strong words for the community of faith to hear, that they should still be trying harder to find out what pleases the Lord. This is a word for wayward Christians. And now it feels a little bit different when verse 11 is aimed at me, or that others are hearing it regarding my own living out of faith, my own leadership. That if a fellow Christian is taking part in the unfruitful works of darkness, that needs to be exposed. As believers, as children of God, as children of light who are brought into that light because of who Jesus is. Jesus' claim on us comes also with this calling to be different. And what distinguishes us from the darkness is light. And the passage concludes, for it is shameful even to mention what such people do secretly. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible. For everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Now it's easy to hear those verses and be a little bit timid, a little bit worried about it, like are there things in my life that I have done that I would be frightened about coming to the light? Yes, there are. But it seems that when we worry more about our darkness being exposed to light, that those become the times when we might find ourselves being pretty pitifully faithful. Because the truth we have about Jesus is that he is light. His life was a light for all people, and his light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. If it's the light of Christ that shines on us, even our own darkness can't stand that, can't overcome that, and it can't overcome us. And so, as that resolves here in Ephesians chapter 5, it says, for everything that becomes visible is light. So even when we allow our own personal darkness and dark secret deeds to be exposed to Jesus' light, those things are transformed and they don't matter anymore because the light of Christ shines beyond, through them, exposing them. Um, and we are made new. So we're no longer slaves to the dark things. We're no longer submissive to the dark things. But we find ourselves changed by light, and we become light. So this little verse at the end of verse 14 is very important then. Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. This is in quotes here at the end of verse 14, and it's very possible that this line was familiar to those folks in Ephesus who were reading this letter, that they might have been hearing a line from a hymn that they sang together. That's possible that it was a line from an ancient hymn. It's also constructed around words that were very familiar to them if they were good students of their own Bibles. It's possible that the source for this is Isaiah 60, verse 1. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. What this little hymn line does for us is it helps us remember that we don't have to be passive about our faith. We try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. And it's Jesus who calls us out of darkness into light. And so rise from the dead. You know, that's some pretty stark darkness there. Rise from the dead and Christ will shine on you. So it is still very good advice about how we are called to live every day. And if you don't remember the ancient hymn line that's in Ephesians chapter 5, you've probably been to camp enough to sing, rise, shine, and give God the glory. Let's work on doing that, trying to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. Amen, and see you next time.